Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Sustaining Sustainability. I'm your host, CB Bhattacharya, Professor and Director of the Center for Sustainable Business at the University of Pittsburgh. This week, I'm joined by Dr. Sweta Chakraborty. Dr. Chakraborty is a risk and behavioral scientist whose career is marked by an interest for communication, policy, and mitigation of risks that threaten human security and well-being. She is the U.S. representative for We Don't Have Time, the Sweden-based tech startup that launched Greta Thunberg to viral global renown, co-hosts the weekly radio show Risky Behavior on Eaton Radio, and is the host and producer of the Climate and Security podcast. She earned her undergraduate degree in decision sciences and international relations at Carnegie Mellon University and received her PhD in risk management from King's College London. She also completed a postdoctorate at Oxford University and worked as an adjunct professor at Columbia University. We've invited Dr. Chakraborty to join us this week to talk about her career as a scientist and communicator, the biases behind human perceptions and decisions in issues like climate change and the COVID pandemic, and how science can contribute to a more inclusive society. Sweta, welcome to the show.
Thank you, CB. It's nice to have my name pronounced correctly by a fellow Bengali.
Sweta, you have an academic background from prestigious institutions around the world. You also have experience as a professor and have considerable collection of published articles and a book. Why leave a traditional academic career to become, in your own words, a risk communicator?
I realized that I can contribute my value to addressing the climate crisis much better from outside of academia and in the policy and media worlds than I can from within academia. I have immense amount of respect for those who stay in academia and pursue that as a career path. And it's one of those things that once you get a PhD and you go down that route, you never really leave. And so it's always something that will be close to what I engage with and work with. I have close colleagues that I confer with on a regular basis to ensure that what I'm communicating is the most up-to-date, cutting-edge, innovative research and science to make sure that all the evidence and the data that I'm putting forward is accurate. And there's consensus from the scientific community. But my particular skill set is to translate that data and that science. And that's something historically, unfortunately, scientists have not done a good job in doing, especially when it comes to communicating information that's relevant to the public in a way that they can understand it and then they can act on it. And so because I studied behavioral science and how people interpret data and risk, and then how they make decisions then based on that data, I realized that it's really the science of communication that wasn't being applied to taking into account the way that the brain processes risk. So knowing and studying that space, I thought, let me actually apply the science to science communication and then better communicate science on behalf of the great research that's out there. So that's really where I saw my skill being most relevant and helpful to address the climate crisis, give people the information they need to better act on the reality of what they're facing and secure their futures and their families' futures and their communities' futures. That to me became what my calling was.
A relevant part of your work is focused on how innate human biases affect our ability to make decisions. Can you talk more about how those biases affect how people react to complex but pressing issues like climate change?
We are being influenced by what I refer to as cognitive triggers without even realizing it. And that's because that's the way our brains have been wired. Since the dawn of our species, we are wired to factor into our decision making things like how urgent a risk is, how immediate it appears to be. Does it impact our children? Does it impact the elderly? These are all things that influence us, whether we even realize it or not. And as our society has modernized, our brains haven't actually evolved fast enough to keep pace with the really complex interconnected landscape that we are now operating in. So our ancestors would see a snake or see a tiger, and they would jumpstart their fight response to react and run away. And that worked out really great. But now, when the risks that we're facing are slow moving or far away or impacting human existence, like climate change and its many ripple effects, or something like COVID-19 breaking out, which is invisible, we can't see it. These are the kinds of risks that we aren't actually designed to address and to proactively prepare against. So these are the challenges that I'm dealing with, to try and make risks that really do impact the reality of our existence today and make it relevant and urgent so we can actually be proactively prepared against them.
What then would constitute a feasible and informed response from individuals and organizations to our current climate crisis?
It would make most sense right now for there to be levels of decision making all the way from local, all the way up to global governance at the multilateral level. And individuals need to make better decisions by being aware of how they are perceiving the risks that they're confronted with. Is it because something is just salient because the media is amplifying it? And are people overreacting to risk because of that? Like an example I like to give is plane crashes. Why is so much attention given to plane crashes when it's actually a relatively minor risk compared to the risk landscape of things that impact human beings yearly, versus something like cardiovascular disease, which is the number one killer of Americans, and hundreds of thousands of Americans die from it, and yet there's not enough proactive preparedness against offsetting those cardiovascular outcomes, negative ones like heart attacks and strokes, in a way that actually commensurates to the reality of that risk. And so we need to become better calibrated as individuals and really align the reality with our perceptions. If we can do that, then those who we vote into power, policymakers, our decision makers, our representatives, they can then represent us more accurately to the reality of the risk that we face, because we will demand from them to allocate resources in a way that's aligned to these realities. We have limited resources, and we need decision makers to say, this is what's really going to hurt us. This is where we need to put our time, our resources, our attention, and our dollars ultimately. So it's really important at the individual level we become better calibrated, so those who represent us have the political will to truly address the risks that we face. And this goes all the way up to multilateral efforts, the UN, the IMF, even regional groups like ASEAN in Southeast Asia. These groups need to then represent their regional to global interests, so we can recognize that some of what we're facing, much of what we're facing, does not respect any sort of political borders. These are risks that transcend arbitrary country designs. So climate change does not respect immigration. It does not have to go through TSA checkpoints. Neither does COVID-19. So we're dealing with a lot of cross-border issues, and we need to figure out a way to globally work together that's in the best interest of the global population. But it starts with individuals recognizing that they need to be better calibrated to the risks that we face.
You're frequently interviewed by national media outlets to talk about how severe climate events like storms, floods, and even snow are connected to climate change. Now we are facing a global pandemic. Is climate change connected to this pandemic in some way? Should we expect more global health crises like COVID-19 in the future?
Unfortunately, yes. And I know that sounds scary to listeners, but ultimately, I'm trying to scare you. That's what gets through the cognitive barriers and the resistance that we have wired into our brains. We need to scare people with the reality of the truth, which is this is a crisis. This is an emergency. But I don't need to just leave people scared. The goal is to get through, get on the radar of awareness that this is a real crisis, and then give positive solutions. Let's collaborate. Let's work together. Let's contribute a little bit of that skill, that expertise, that human ingenuity to come up with solutions and really tackle this climate crisis. Because yes, COVID-19 is a ripple effect of climate change, like many other things: food insecurity, water scarcity, increased human migrations, increased violence. These are all being amplified because the planet is warming. Some of these things would have happened anyway, but it's getting that much worse. And this is something that the national security communities in the United States and around the world recognize, that this really is getting exacerbated by climate change. So we need to recognize that. And if we can address the planet warming and stop that trajectory from getting any further than 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, which is where we really need to max out, then we can begin to think about what the world will look like at that temperature point. But we can't get any hotter than that. If we do, we can anticipate increasing frequency and probability of hurricanes, of wildfires, of droughts, of extreme weather events, of infectious disease outbreaks. They are very, very connected, and we want to offset those worst case scenarios, especially those impacts happening simultaneously.
We know that these severe events do not affect all people in the same way. Recently, the New York Times and even the CDC published articles about how racial and ethnic minorities are being disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Sweta, from your perspective, how can science and the field of risk management help us mitigate this type of disproportional impact and help us build a more inclusive society?
That, to me, is the main thing to do. Here in the United States, after Biden became president, it became very clear that addressing for past wrongs, just environmental racism and the history of it here in the U.S., was something that was going to be front and center to the core tenets of climate change reform. And so that is something that we need to make sure we do at home, so we're not viewed as hypocritical abroad as we tell countries to not only commit to reducing their global emissions, their carbon emissions, and to fall in line with the Paris Accords, but to also be more equitable within their borders and beyond their borders. Because until we do this at home, how can we demand that more broadly? And we have to demand that more broadly going forward as we rethink, reconstruct, and redesign what the world is going to look like in a renewable future. And it does not have to be what it's been all along. We can be much more equitable and much more just. And that's something that isn't just a feel-good or humanitarian thing to do. It's a real, true national security and protecting national sovereignties around the world. If you have people that feel or that are oppressed or unjustly on the receiving end of bad policies and bad practices, you're going to eventually at some point be impacted by them by those policies and practices in a way that we don't even want to consider or see. We're already seeing human migrations of people, and that's going to increase, and it's going to increase simultaneously across the globe as parts of the world become uninhabitable. So as we reimagine and rethink what the future is going to look like, equity has to be core to that. So everybody can look forward to a future, and that desperation is erased from our collective humanity.
Fascinating conversation. But sadly, we are coming to the end of our time today. What is the most important message you want to convey to businesses during the COVID-19 era?
Businesses need to get ahead of being held to their feet being held to the fire. It's really a reckoning time for private sector. Even those that still continue to operate under business ethos alone, so just pure profit and pure just thinking of shareholders, that is no longer a place that businesses can operate from. Consumers are more aware than ever that there's a reason that their lives were grounded to a screeching halt, that COVID-19 stopped lives and livelihoods. And as consumers become more aware and have more time to compare and contrast across options, products, and services, it's going to be that consumer demand, I believe, that really makes businesses recognize that you can't just be in it for the pure outcome of business. You need to recognize that you are part of this operating ecosystem, and it is time to recognize that practicing good business practices means happy consumers and a happy planet in which you can operate in and continue to have happy consumers. So we're all stakeholders in this, and the underlying ethos of operation is shifting from business strictly to sustainability going forward. I think it's more clear than ever that that's the case.
And finally, what call to action would you make to our other listeners?
I would ask everybody to take the time to confront their innate biases. If there's an immediate assessment of risk that comes to surface, question as to why that is there. So if something, for example, is brought to your attention via the news, and then you're starting to feel something along the lines of, I should be scared of this, or I should change my behavior, or maybe I should purchase a gun because I'm fearful of some sort of potential risk to my person or to my family. Actually look at the base rate statistics, actually do the research, take the time to find out whether or not whether or not the perception that is forming is entrenched in data, is entrenched in science, is entrenched in the numbers. Because often, as what we kicked off this conversation with, more often than not, our perceptions are not aligned to the reality of the risk. So make an effort to become better calibrated as individuals, demand that our decision makers are aligned to the reality of the risk that we face. And that is step one at the individual level, to really be able to start to make an impact, and reach out to your peers and co-collaborators around the world. There's technology and tools today that are available, especially online. It's incredible how far we've come with the internet and its ability to connect people. There's an app, the group that I work for, called We Don't Have Time, totally free to use. Go ahead and use it. 25 million reach right now, and it connects you to those who are fighting climate change and those who are sustainability minded. And here's an opportunity to just amplify from one individual user to finding like-minded peers around the world that maybe have a shared interest in a particular issue or campaign. And now all of a sudden you've got power in numbers. So that's really where true change can take off. So I would love to see people take the time to confront their innate biases and to join forces through some of the technologies and tools that we have available to us today.
Sweta Chakraborty, thank you so much for spending some of your precious time with us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
This is your host, CB Bhattacharya, saying goodbye, and I look forward to seeing you next time for another edition of Sustaining Sustainability.